It is clear in the novel In Cold Blood that Truman Capote portrays Perry Smith in a very sympathetic way in comparison to his accomplice Richard Hickok. In this presentation, I'm going to explain similarities in the lives of Capote and Smith and how they affected Capote's writing of the novel In Cold Blood. Even as a child, he had a morbid curiosity about the outcasts of society, especially if there was some sort of ghoulish mystery involved. This is a quote from Marie Rudisil, Truman Capote's aunt, with whose family he spent his childhood. This statement perfectly captured Capote's life and writings. Each of his novels received criticism for exploration of topics the public was not entirely comfortable with, yet fascinated by. In Cold Blood and its detail of the 1959 murders of the Clutter family was no exception. It is clear in this novel that Capote portrays Perry Smith in a far more human light than his accomplice, Richard Hickok. Capote gives detail about his life and conflicted nature throughout the novel, a grace he withholds from Hickok. In fact, Capote chooses to highlight Hickok's worst traits rather than work for the reader's sympathy for him. Hickok is portrayed as cold, calculating, and with unwavering self-confidence about the crime they're about to commit. Smith, on the other hand, is written to be hesitant, overthinking, compassionate, but still brutal. If Capote were drawn to societal outcasts, it seems he should have been equally drawn to Smith and Hickok, but this was not the case. Interviewing both murderers shone a light on distinct parallels between his life and Smith's. In his novel In Cold Blood, Capote works for the reader's sympathy on behalf of Perry Smith because he shares Smith's similar trauma in early life, common interests, and struggles with substance abuse. To explore these similarities, first I'm going to break down each man's life. Capote's fascination with people who did not fit in most likely stemmed from his own feeling of being out of place. His early life was saturated with loneliness. The unwanted product of a marriage between a supposed-to-be wealthy man and a promiscuous, selfish woman who did not love each other, he was abandoned to live with his aunts, uncle, and cousins. He found it difficult to relate to others, but had a few intense relationships, notably one with his favorite aunt, Nancy Sook Falk, and another with the famous author Nellie Harper Lee, both of whom influenced characters in his published works. Capote hated school but enjoyed learning. He took it upon himself one summer to memorize a Webster's dictionary he found in the house. He was drawn to stories, writing them, hearing them, fabricating them, telling them, and watching them on the big screen, especially horror movies. Sook enlisted his help in various crafts and projects from an early age, cultivating his love of creation in general. His relatives and peers observed his social differences and unusual hobbies, and while they accepted and cared for him, he never fit in. He was described by his aunts, uncle, and cousins as, and these are quotes, a cold, insensitive child whose faults were quite incurable, heartless and calculating, mystically inclined and spiritual, and possessed of the very devil. Those are from his aunt's book that I quoted in the previous slide. Being unwanted, lonely, misunderstood, and misfitted began to take a toll on Capote. Caught in the throes of his parents' mutual hatred for each other, he identified as an outcast and let these noxious circumstances and feelings simmer into an ever-deepening depression. Still too young to truly understand these feelings, he sought refuge by embracing loneliness and pushing further into solitude. His parents divorced when he was 4, and 3 years later his mother sent for him to come live with her and her new husband in New York. There, Capote was moved around apartments and shuffled between schools, many of which he flunked out of. In a final effort to get him to conform, his stepfather sent him to St. John's Military Academy, where he had a terrible time. Capote dropped out of school at 17 and began working odd jobs, eventually returning to New York, where he broke into the mainstream with his O. Henry award-winning short story, Miriam. Capote never was able to escape depression and believed, and this is a quote, that his unhappiness came not only from what he regarded as desertion by his mother, but also by the betrayals he has felt all his life by friends and lovers. He was homosexual, a trait which caused his mother to spurn him further. She later committed suicide. He had no real relationship with his real father, and he hated his stepfather. Despite being a media sensation, he found himself empty and lonely except a few close, intense relationships. By the time he began work on In Cold Blood, Capote began to take tranquilizers in an attempt to cope with the pressures of work and the intensity of feelings for one of the murderers in the case. That's a quote from Helen Garson's book, Truman Capote. He would continue to use drugs and binge drink until his death in 1984. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Perry Smith. He was the child of an absent father and an alcoholic prostitute mother. Though he was intelligent, school ended in 3rd grade for him. His mother suffocated on her own vomit after a binge, and he and his siblings were put in the care of orphanages where Smith was abused. His father removed him from these, but his life did not improve much. They lived out of his father's car, and he could not seem to get along with his father or with anyone else. Supremely distrusting of others, Smith had few close relationships. At the age of 16, he left and joined the Merchant Marines, but his career was ultimately ended by a motorcycle accident, which left him with mangled legs and an addiction to painkillers. He tried to go back to live with his father, who grew increasingly dissatisfied with his son and began abusing him. After being kicked out of the house, Smith found work doing odd jobs, which gave way to a burglary. It was in prison that he met Richard Hickok, with whom he would later commit and be convicted for the Clutter family murders. Perry was also gifted in the arts. He was a great painter, and he would often draw portraits and paint pictures of the other prisoners in prison. Now that I've discussed both of their lives individually, I'm gonna draw comparisons. It was easy for Capote to see himself in Smith. Both had been lonely children with dreams of being famous. Both had grown up societal misfits and identified as such, having few close relationships and traumatized by the neglect and abandonment they experienced at the hands of their parents. Their promiscuous mothers had died via suicide, and their relationships with their fathers were characterized by absence and tension. Both had moved around many times and lived through poverty and forms of homelessness. They did not feel they belonged anywhere. Though they loved learning, neither had good experiences with school or the military and had to resort to odd jobs to support themselves. They both possessed unusual propensities for the arts and strong imaginations. Both were homosexual. Both were small in stature, effeminate, and had tendencies of harmful behavior and draws to morbidity. Capote's manifesting in fascination with all things dark, gruesome, or feared by society, in rude jests such as taunting his deaf cousin Lucille and in lying, and Smith's urging him to petty crimes and eventually murder. Subjects of lifelong depression, both sought refuge from pain and life in the abuse of drugs and alcohol. So, what exactly does this mean? It boils down to Capote related a lot to Smith. All of those things were really heavy traumas, and finding someone you can connect to about stuff like that creates a deep, deep tie between two people. Capote saw himself in Perry Smith. He saw good in himself and good in Smith, and I think he wanted the reader to see this good. If he could earn the reader's sympathy on behalf of Perry Smith, it's likely that he could earn the reader's sympathy on behalf of himself. There are some things, however, that don't really check out. Capote's 6,000 pages of notes, accumulated newspaper clippings, interviews with other murderers. Within all of this stuff, there were no recorded interviews, so it calls into question the accuracy of his portrayal of Smith. Since there really isn't much documentation of Smith's life other than what we know from Capote and from other interviews with Smith, it's really difficult to gauge the accuracy of this portrayal. When you look at their lives, Smith and Capote actually had a lot of differences as well. Now I'm going to explore some of those differences with you. At first glance, the act of murder seems to be the truest point of divergence in the lives of Capote and Smith, and on paper, it's not difficult to project a path for Capote that would have continued parallel to Smith's, but there are other points to consider. Smith's more extreme facets of violence and mercilessness may have stemmed from the abuse he was subjected to in the orphanages and by his father. Capote could not have seen himself in that. While his childhood was indeed difficult, Capote was never beaten or nearly drowned in buckets of ice water as Smith was. Capote also had his mother present throughout the first 30 years of his life, whereas Smith had his for only his early childhood. Capote was never close to his mother and was absent when she committed suicide. For Smith, early loss after living with and depending on his mother and the memory of her death was something he continually had to live with. Being exposed to such horrific instances early in life likely desensitized him to violence he committed on his own, allowing him to kill the Clutters. Smith was also considerably poorer growing up than Capote ever was. He was less educated and had much less family support. Smith's hardships were concrete situations. He had no family aside from a father and two siblings who spurned him. He was abused, and he witnessed his mother's suicide, and he grew up in poverty. Capote's were much more entangled in emotions. He had a family who took care of him, but with whom he could not relate. He had to navigate the toxicity of his parents' relationship and cope with the fact that they did not want him. He had plenty of opportunities to go to school, but chose to flunk out. He experienced poverty when living with his mother in New York, but had enough to get by in his early life. Considering all of these differences between these men, the divergence of life paths makes sense. Despite all these differences, Capote likely saw Smith as an alternate version of himself. If a few slightly different ingredients had been added to or subtracted from his life, Capote easily could have seen himself turning down a similar path. Smith may have even seen Capote as the man he could have been had he had a few different opportunities. The two men's past and similar experiences with loneliness, pain, and misfittedness inherently bonded them, so much so that after Smith's death, Capote had in his possession a huge collection of files containing research material, letters, newspaper clippings, court records, and the belongings of Perry Smith, which included his books, letters, paintings, and drawings. Capote could not look at him without empathy and understanding. In Cold Blood contained a factual account of the Clutter murders and a blatant plea on behalf of Smith for the reader's sympathy. In an interview with George Plimpton, Capote stated, "I believe Perry did what he did for reasons he himself states, that his life was a constant accumulation of disillusionments and reverses, and suddenly he found himself in the Clutter house that night in a psychological cul-de-sac. The Clutters were a perfect set of symbols for every frustration in his life. As Perry himself said, I didn't have anything against them, and they never did anything wrong to me, the way other people have all my life. Maybe they're just the ones who had to pay for it." To Capote, the concept that Smith needed to be understood and sympathized with was undeniably true. Subconsciously, he may have even been expressing a desire to be understood and sympathized with himself. If he could show the world Smith's pain and conflict as an explanation for his depravity, perhaps he could inadvertently explain himself as well. In his novel In Cold Blood, Truman Capote works for the reader's sympathy for Perry Smith because he sees himself in Smith, and because he's searching for sympathy himself.